My name is Diane Foster, I'm 44 years old, and 8 months ago I received a letter that started the strangest and most satisfying chapter of my entire life. It came on cream-colored HOA letterhead, folded into thirds, sitting in my mailbox between a pizza coupon and a water bill. It informed me that my backyard garden was in violation of Meadow Hollow Estates Community Bylaws, Section 14, Subsection B, Landscaping Standards and Aesthetic Uniformity. I had 30 days to correct the violation or face a fine of $500 a day until compliance was achieved. $500 a day. I remember standing at the end of my driveway rereading that number 3 times, because I genuinely thought it was a typo. 500 cents, maybe. $5, sure, that I could believe. But $500 a day for what the letter described as an unkempt, overgrown, and visually offensive natural area was, frankly, absurd. I want to tell you exactly how this unfolded, because by the end of this story, an HOA board that thought it was untouchable found out the hard way that some pieces of land don't belong to homeowners associations at all. They belong to the wetlands, the water table, and, as it turns out, the federal government. The garden. To understand why this letter made no sense, you need to understand my backyard. When my husband Mark and I bought our house in Meadow Hollow Estates 6 years ago, we specifically chose the lot because of what the listing agent called a low-maintenance natural buffer along the back third of the property. What she really meant, though neither of us fully grasped it at the time, was that our backyard sloped down into a shallow basin that stayed damp nearly year-round, fed by a spring somewhere upslope and by runoff from 3 streets worth of storm drains. For the first year, I tried to fight it. I brought in truckloads of soil, tried to level it out, planted a lawn like everyone else's. The grass drowned every spring. Anything I planted that wasn't suited to standing water simply rotted at the roots. After about 18 months of expensive failure, I did something that changed everything. I stopped fighting the land and started listening to it. I researched native wetland plants for our region. I planted blue flag iris, swamp milkweed, cardinal flower, buttonbush, and soft rush. I let the sedges come in naturally along the water's edge. Within 2 growing seasons, the transformation was remarkable. Frogs showed up first, then dragonflies in colors I didn't know existed outside of postcards, then songbirds that I'd never once seen at my feeder out front. One spring morning I watched a great blue heron stalk through the shallow water like it owned the place, and in some very real sense, it did. My neighbors on either side were kind about it. Mrs. Petrosky, who has lived in the neighborhood for almost 30 years, used to bring her grandchildren over just to look for frogs. But not everyone on the board shared her appreciation. And that's really where this story begins, not with the wetland, but with a woman named Carol Ashby. Carol had been HOA president for about 2 years by the time my garden matured into what it is today. She ran unopposed both times, mostly because nobody else wanted the headache of the job, and she treated the position less like a volunteer role and more like a small kingdom. Her own front yard was a masterclass in suburban uniformity, dyed mulch, boxwood spheres trimmed into identical shapes, and a lawn so aggressively green the first sometimes wondered if it was real. She had, on more than one occasion at community meetings, used the phrase curb appeal is community pride, as though it were scripture. I'd had informal run INS with Carol before. She once left a note on my car about a garden gnome she considered tacky. She'd commented at a block party that my swamp was probably breeding mosquitoes, which, for the record, was not true. My garden's frog and dragonfly population kept mosquito numbers lower than most of my neighbors' manicured lawns. But I never expected an actual formal violation, let alone one with a fine structure aggressive enough to bankrupt a small business. The escalation. I called the HOA management office the day after receiving the letter, mostly confused rather than angry. I spoke to a property manager named Todd who handled the paperwork for several HOAs in the region, and clearly didn't have strong feelings either way. He explained that the violation had been filed by board vote, cited under the Aesthetic Uniformity Clause, and that my 30-day window to restore the lawn to community standard had already started ticking. What exactly counts as community standard? I asked him. Turf grass, maintained to a height of no more than 4 inches, free of standing water, with defined garden beds along the perimeter only, he read from what sounded like a printed sheet. I explained, as calmly as I could, that the area in question was a natural wet meadow that had existed on the property long before the subdivision was built, that it managed stormwater for at least 6 surrounding lots, and that draining it or converting it to turf would likely just create the flooding problem my neighbors didn't currently have. Todd said he understood, but that he wasn't authorized to waive fines, Only the board could do that, and I'd need to request an appeal hearing. So I requested the hearing. It was scheduled for the following month, which meant 30 days would already have elapsed by the time I got in front of the board, and the fines, theoretically, would already be stacking up. $500 a day, for 30 days, is $15,000. I want to be very clear about something here. I was not going to pay that. Not because I was trying to be defiant for the sake of it, but because I was fairly certain, even before I did any research, that what I had was not a lawn problem. It was a legal one, and not in the direction Carol Ashby expected. In the days that followed, I got a small taste of just how seriously the board intended to pursue this. A second letter arrived less than a week after the first, this one a courtesy reminder that fines would begin accruing automatically on day 31 regardless of the outcome of any scheduled appeal, and that repeated non-compliance could eventually result in a lien being placed against my home. A lien. Over frogs and cardinal flowers. I remember reading that line out loud to Mark at the kitchen table, and neither of us being entirely sure whether to laugh or panic. I also made the mistake, early on, of trying to reason with Carol informally, neighbor to neighbor, before things escalated further. I caught her walking her dog one evening and asked, as pleasantly as I could manage, whether the board might reconsider given that the area had never been ordinary lawn to begin with. She told me, almost verbatim, that every yard in this neighborhood can be lawn if the owner puts in the effort, and that she personally found the tall grasses an eyesore that drags down everyone's property values. I asked her if she'd ever had anyone look at whether the area even qualified as a wetland. She said that wasn't the board's concern. The bylaws didn't distinguish between wetlands and weeds, and as far as she was concerned, they didn't need to. That conversation, more than the letters themselves, was what convinced me this wasn't going to resolve itself through politeness. If the board genuinely believed bylaws could simply override environmental law by never mentioning it, someone needed to show them, in writing, from an authority they couldn't dismiss, that this wasn't true. That night, I sat down with Mark and we made a plan. Step 1 was documentation. I walked the entire wet area with my phone, photographing plant species, standing water depth, wildlife activity, everything. Step 2 was research. And step 3, the one that would end up mattering most, was figuring out exactly what kind of land I actually owned. What the land actually was. I want to take a moment here, because this is the part of the story people always ask me about afterward. How did I even know to look into wetland protections in the first place? The honest answer is that a friend of mine, Renata, works as an environmental science teacher, and over dinner one night, months before any of this HOA drama started, she'd casually mentioned that my backyard had all the hallmarks of a jurisdictional wetland. At the time, it was just an interesting fact. Once the fine letter arrived, it became the thread I decided to pull. I started with my county's GIS mapping system, a public online tool that lets you overlay different environmental and zoning data on satellite images of your property. Sure enough, when I toggled on the wetlands layer, a shaded blue polygon appeared across almost the entire back third of my lot, labeled as a mapped wetland area connected to a tributary that eventually fed into a larger regional watershed. That was promising, but I needed more than a colored polygon on a website. So I called my state's Department of Environmental Protection and asked, plainly, whether a homeowner could be legally required to drain or convert a mapped wetland into turf grass. The woman I spoke with, a wetland specialist, was very direct. Doing so without a permit could constitute a violation of state wetland protection statutes, and depending on the wetland's connection to navigable waters, potentially federal law under the Clean Water Act as well. She recommended I request an official wetland delineation, which is a formal site survey conducted by a certified wetland scientist to determine the precise boundaries and classification of the wetland. I hired a delineator out of pocket. It cost me $1,100, which felt like a lot at the time, but turned out to be the best investment I've ever made in this house. 3 weeks later, I had a full report in hand. My backyard wasn't just kind of wet. It was a confirmed, jurisdictional freshwater emergent wetland, hydrologically connected via an intermittent stream to a creek that fed into a federally regulated river system. The report even noted the presence of a plant species considered a regional indicator of high-quality wetland habitat, and flagged potential habitat use by a state-listed species of concern, a small salamander that Renata later told me was notoriously picky about where it lived. In plain terms, my ugly garden was not landscaping. It was a federally regulated aquatic resource, sitting quietly in a suburban backyard, that an HOA board was ordering me to pave over with sod under threat of financial ruin. I remember sitting at my kitchen table reading that report front to back 3 times, partly out of disbelief and partly because I wanted to make absolutely sure I understood every term before I brought it anywhere near the HOA board. The delineator, a soft-spoken man named Phil who'd spent nearly 2 decades doing this kind of survey work, walked me through the findings over the phone. He explained that the wetland boundary he'd flagged with pink survey tape covered close to 60% of my rear property line, that the hydric soil samples he'd taken confirmed prolonged seasonal saturation consistent with a true wetland rather than a simple drainage puddle, and that the presence of certain obligate wetland plant species, ones that literally cannot survive anywhere except saturated soil, was, in his words, about as clear-cut a wetland determination as I've made all year. He also mentioned something that stuck with me for weeks afterward, that he occasionally gets called out to HOA disputes exactly like mine, homeowners accused of neglecting a yard that was never buildable lawn to begin with, and that in his experience, most HOA boards have no idea such protections even exist until someone forces them to find out. People assume wetlands are something you find way out in a nature preserve, he told me. They forget they can be sitting in a subdivision that got built around them 30 years ago. Armed with his report, I spent an entire weekend organizing everything into a single binder, the delineation itself, the County GIS wetland overlay printed in color, a short written summary of Section 404 of the Clean Water Act explaining why filling or draining jurisdictional wetlands generally requires a federal permit, and photographs I'd taken over the previous 2 seasons showing the heron, the dragonflies, and the seasonal blooms. I wanted the board to see, in one sitting, that this wasn't a homeowner being difficult. It was documented, verifiable science. The appeal hearing. By the time my appeal hearing rolled around, I walked in with a folder thick enough that Todd the property manager actually laughed when he saw it. Inside were the wetland delineation report, the county GIS maps, photographs of wildlife activity, and a printed summary of relevant state and federal wetland regulations, highlighted in 3 different colors. The hearing took place in the clubhouse meeting room, under fluorescent lighting that made everyone look a little tired. Carol Ashby sat at the head of the table flanked by 2 other board members, Gary and Linda, neither of whom said much the entire meeting. Carol opened by reading the original violation aloud, emphasizing words like unkempt and community standard as though repetition made them more true. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply laid the delineation report on the table, slid it toward Carol, and asked her to read the first page highlighted section, which stated plainly that the area in question met federal criteria for jurisdictional wetland status under Clean Water Act guidelines. Carol skimmed it, visibly uncomfortable, and said something like, "This is just one contractor's opinion. Our bylaws don't have an exception for personal landscaping choices." I explained, as evenly as I could, that this wasn't a landscaping choice, it was existing, protected habitat that predated the subdivision itself, and that federal and state law generally prohibits filling, draining, or otherwise altering such areas without a permit from the Army Corps of Engineers and, in this case, likely additional review given the presence of a species of concern. I told her that converting it to turf grass, as the violation letter demanded, would not just violate HOA aesthetic preferences, it would potentially violate federal law, and that neither I, nor frankly the HOA itself, had any legal authority to order that kind of alteration without going through a formal permitting process that could take months or years, if it was even approved at all. There was a long pause. Gary shifted in his seat. Linda asked, quietly, whether the HOA could be liable for something if they forced the issue. Carol didn't answer that question. Instead, she pivoted, saying the board would take the new information under advisement and would issue a decision within 2 weeks. The fines, she added, would continue to accrue in the meantime, since the appeal itself didn't automatically pause the violation. That was the moment I decided the HOA board wasn't going to handle this reasonably on their own. It was time to go over their heads. Calling in federal attention. I want to be honest about something here. I didn't originally set out to get federal agencies involved in a dispute with my homeowners association. That sounds like an enormous overreaction to a fine letter. But once I understood that the HOA was actively pressuring me, under financial threat, to fill and convert a federally protected wetland, I realized this wasn't really a private dispute anymore. It touched on regulations that exist specifically to prevent exactly this kind of thing, a wetland being destroyed because someone decided it looked messy. I contacted my regional office of the Army Corps of Engineers, which oversees permitting for wetland alteration under the Clean Water Act. I explained the situation, a delineated jurisdictional wetland on my property, an HOA demanding its conversion to turf grass under threat of daily fines, and my concern that continued pressure might eventually force some kind of unauthorized fill or drainage action, either by me under duress or by the HOA itself if they decided to send a crew. The Corps representative I spoke with took detailed notes and told me that if any unauthorized fill, grading, or drainage occurred on a delineated wetland like mine, it would be treated as a potential violation subject to investigation, and could result in significant civil penalties. He mentioned figures that made the HOA's $500 a day fine look almost quaint by comparison. He also connected me with a colleague at the Environmental Protection Agency's Regional Wetlands Enforcement Division, since EPA and the Corps often coordinate on Clean Water Act enforcement. Separately, because of the mention of a state-listed salamander species in my delineation report, I also reached out to my state's Department of Natural Resources, which flagged the potential habitat concern for further review. Between the three conversations, I wasn't accusing anyone of having already broken the law. Nothing had been destroyed yet. But I made sure that every agency with potential jurisdiction had a documented record of an HOA actively pressuring a homeowner to alter a protected wetland, in writing, with financial penalties attached. I also did one more thing that I think mattered enormously. I sent a formal written notice to the HOA board, care of their management company, stating clearly that continued enforcement of the aesthetic violation against the wetland area could constitute inducement to violate federal and state wetland protection law, and that I had already contacted the Army Corps of Engineers, EPA, and State Department of Natural Resources to make them aware of the situation. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, so there could be no claim later that they hadn't received it. Everything changes. For about 10 days after I sent that letter, there was silence. No fine notices, no calls from Todd, nothing. I genuinely didn't know what was happening behind the scenes, and I'll admit I spent those 10 days a little anxious, wondering if I'd overplayed my hand. Then I got a call, not from Carol, but from Todd, sounding noticeably more careful than usual. He informed me that the Army Corps of Engineers Regional Office had reached out directly to the HOA's management company requesting documentation related to the violation notice issued against my property, specifically asking whether the HOA had directed or was directing a property owner to fill or convert a wetland area without proper authorization. He said the management company's legal counsel had gotten involved, and that the board had been advised to pause all enforcement action on my property pending review. I later learned, through a neighbor who happened to be present, that this advisement came during an emergency board session that Carol had called after receiving a formal inquiry letter from the Corps Regulatory Division. According to my neighbor, the HOA's own attorney reportedly told the board, in no uncertain terms, that if they had actually succeeded in pressuring a homeowner into destroying a jurisdictional wetland, the association itself, not just me, could be named in a federal enforcement action, with penalties assessed against the HOA's corporate entity and potentially against individual board members who knowingly directed the violation. That reportedly did not go over well in the room. My neighbor also mentioned that Gary, one of the quieter board members, apparently spoke up during that session for the first time in months, pointing out that he'd raised a concern about the wetland status privately to Carol weeks earlier, after noticing the same GIS overlay I had while looking up his own property boundaries out of curiosity. According to my neighbor, Gary said he'd been told at the time that it wasn't relevant to the violation and that the board should proceed as planned. Whether that's exactly how the conversation went, I can't say for certain. I wasn't in the room, but it lined up with something I'd suspected all along, that at least one person on that board had a nagging feeling something was off and had been overruled anyway. I also found out, through the same neighbor grapevine, that the management company's attorney had specifically flagged the fine structure itself as a liability. $500 a day, uncapped, tied to a demand that could require violating federal law to satisfy, was apparently the kind of detail that makes HOA insurance carriers extremely uncomfortable. Whatever the exact internal reasoning was, the outcome was the same. Enforcement stopped, and it stopped fast. Within 3 weeks, I received a new letter from the HOA. This one read very differently. It stated that, upon further review of additional documentation regarding the environmental classification of the affected area, the board was rescinding the original violation notice and all associated fines. It went on to say that the bylaw's landscaping standards would be clarified going forward to include an exception for legally protected natural features, including wetlands. No acknowledgement that this whole situation had been triggered by nothing more than one board member's personal opinion that my garden looked messy. But I got what mattered most. The fines were gone, my wetland stayed exactly as it was, and the bylaws were being rewritten so this couldn't happen to anyone else in the neighborhood. The aftermath. Word travels fast in a neighborhood like mine. and it wasn't long before most of Meadow Hollow Estates knew some version of what had happened. Mrs. Petrosky told me she'd never seen Carol so quiet at a community meeting as she was the month after the rescission letter went out. A few neighbors who'd previously been mildly annoyed by my wild-looking backyard started asking me questions instead. What plants I'd used, how I'd gotten frogs to show up, whether their own soggy corner of yard might be worth leaving alone instead of fighting. I want to be fair to Carol here, because it would be easy to paint her as a cartoon villain, and I don't think that's entirely accurate. I think she genuinely believed, the way a lot of people do, that a yard which doesn't look like everyone else's yard is automatically a problem to be corrected. I don't think she set out to force a homeowner into breaking federal environmental law. I think she simply never stopped to ask whether the land underneath my ugly garden was hers to have an opinion about in the first place. It wasn't. It belonged to a watershed that existed long before the subdivision, long before the HOA, and honestly, long before any of us. Carol did not run for board president again the following year. I don't know if that was connected to what happened, or simply timing, and I try not to speculate about it publicly. What I do know is that the new board, under different leadership, formally updated the community bylaws to include a specific carve-out protecting legally designated natural areas, including wetlands, from aesthetic landscaping enforcement. They even asked me, a little sheepishly, if I'd be willing to give a short presentation at a community meeting about native wetland gardening. I said yes. That presentation turned into something I never expected. A handful of neighbors have since let their own low-lying yard sections return to something closer to native habitat instead of fighting a losing battle against standing water. My backyard, once labeled visually offensive in an official HOA document I still keep framed in my home office as a reminder, now regularly hosts a mix of frogs, dragonflies, songbirds, and at least one very shy salamander that Renata helped me identify last spring. What this experience taught me. If there's one thing I hope people take away from this story, it's this. Don't assume that a piece of official looking paper, even one with fines and deadlines printed on it, automatically means you're in the wrong. HOAs have real authority over a lot of things, and I'm not here to say boards shouldn't be able to enforce reasonable community standards. But that authority has limits, and those limits are defined by actual law, not by one person's personal taste. I also learned that persistence and documentation matter more than emotion. I never yelled at Carol. I never posted an angry rant in the neighborhood app, even though I badly wanted to some nights. Instead, I got a professional wetland delineation. I researched the actual statutes. I made calls to the right agencies, calmly and factually, and I put everything in writing. That paper trail is ultimately what protected me. Not outrage, but documentation. And maybe most importantly, I learned to trust the piece of land I'd been slowly listening to for years before any of this began. That wet, unglamorous corner of my backyard that drowned my first attempts at a normal lawn turned out to be something far more valuable than curb appeal. It was a functioning wetland, quietly filtering runoff, supporting wildlife, and doing exactly what wetlands have done for thousands of years, long before anyone decided grass needed to be 4 inches tall to count as respectable. These days, when people drive past my house and see the tall grasses, the iris blooms in early summer, the dragonflies hovering over standing water that never quite dries up, I like to think most of them see it for what it actually is now, not an eyesore, but a small, stubborn piece of wild land that refused to be paved over, and a homeowner who was willing to do the homework to prove it deserved to stay exactly the way it was. The frogs, for what it's worth, never once complained about the paperwork. Every so often, a new neighbor moves onto the street and asks me, half joking, why my backyard doesn't look like everyone else's. I've gotten pretty good at telling the short version of the story on the spot. An HOA once tried to fine me $500 a day to drain a federally protected wetland, and lost. Most people laugh at first, assuming I'm exaggerating for effect, until I mention the framed violation letter hanging in my office, right next to a photo Renata took of that shy little salamander poking its head out from under a stand of soft rush. Then they usually just stand there for a second, looking out at the tall grass and the standing water, seeing it a little differently than they did a moment before. I don't say any of this to make Carol or the old board sound foolish for the sake of it. I say it because I think there's a genuinely useful lesson buried in the whole ordeal, one that has nothing to do with wetlands specifically. Somewhere along the way, a lot of us start assuming that official-sounding paperwork automatically outranks the facts on the ground. It doesn't. Bylaws are not the same thing as law, and a board vote does not override a watershed. My garden was never the violation. It was simply the one thing on that street that refused to pretend otherwise.